Now we're going to jump into the portal and this time deploy a platform as a service offering. We're going to be deploying an Azure SQL database. Now I want to tell you right now, the thing that oftentimes throws people for a loop is deploying the Azure SQL Server first, because it's just a logical SQL Server and it feels a little fuzzy the first time you do it. But don't worry, because we're going to make some sense out of it in this video. Let's start deploying an Azure SQL database. Now we're going to have some fun and get a quick and dirty SQL database brought to life using the Azure SQL Platform as a Service offerings. Remember, this one, when we deploy just an individual database, is just that. It's an individual database that by default comes with a publicly accessible, fully qualified domain name. And this is perfect for deployments that are really based on platform as a service offerings that we're going to integrate into many different apps, particularly in the Azure Fabric. We can either go to the SQL virtual machines or just jump in straight into SQL databases. I'm going to do SQL virtual machines first of all, because we do see my SQL virtual machine right here, don't we? Yeah, here it is. I'm going to click create, and then it should jump me into this page right here where we see the three different types of the Azure SQL platform. Now for this video, I'm going to be deploying a single database, but trust me, there is going to be a moment that kind of throws you for a loop the first time you see it. I'm going to click create to jump into the wizard, and we're going to get started with this right now. I'm going to change my subscription to be the right subscription. I'm going to put this into my SQL group, even though it does say SQL IaaS, I know. Now, for the database name, you see some constraints immediately, like it can't end with special characters or contain these particular special characters. The database name shouldn't be empty. Now, we are going to attach this database to a SQL server, and that SQL server, this can't have the same database name of any other databases that are attached to that SQL server. So let's go ahead and type this in. We're going to say Knox SQL. I'm going to call this PAAS for Platform as a Service. And I get the little check mark here that says everything is passing the checks here. Now the SQL server itself is something that we'll have to create for the first time. This is a pretty interesting concept to wrap your head around, because this SQL server isn't like a typical SQL server. This is just a logical instance that you will connect to. This SQL server will have a fully qualified domain name that you will connect to over the public internet for the first time that you connect to it using SSMS. Now, how you connect to it and how you authenticate to it is something that we're going to cover, but I just wanted to wrap your head around this right now. You're not paying for this logical instance. You're paying for the amount of compute that is dedicated to this particular database. And you can have multiple databases connected to this one logical instance, and you'll pay for each of those databases individually. So really, all this SQL server is just a connection point into the associated databases and how you authenticate to it, and that's really about it. Let's go ahead and create this SQL server for the first time. Notice it is going to end with .database.windows.net. So if I call this Knox SQL, check it out. This is uniquely identifiable around the world. I'm going to also put this in South Central US, where the rest of my SQL items are. Now look, here's where we can specify the authentication method. We can use SQL authentication. We can use only Azure Active Directory authentication, and you have to specify an admin up front, or we can use a mixed mode of both. So I'm going to choose mixed mode just for good measure. I'm going to set my Azure AD admin to be myself. I'll search for myself, click on my name, and click select. Now I have an Azure admin located here. I can also specify a manual Azure admin for a login here, a local login for the SQL Server instance itself. Again, this is for the SQL instance, not the given database. You will be able to attach many different databases to that instance, and this is where we're specifying the admin of all of those databases. So I'll click OK here, and now it's going to create a new SQL Server instance that we can specify. Notice here we've got the Elastic Pool option here. We also have compute and storage that we specify here. Now, we covered this in great detail. For very simple reasons, I'm just going to drop this in basic and just leave everything else the same because this is very, very cheap to deploy at $4.90 a month. And this is just a lab environment at the end of the day anyways. So now that I've got the basic tier set for the DTU model, we can also look at the backup storage redundancy. Remember again that backups are automatic with the given Azure SQL database. And when we choose geo-redundant backup storage, this is going to replicate to a different data center, a different region in Azure, and give us read access to those database backups. Now, in the networking tier, this is going to be an interesting thing. You would think that this is what's specifying the connectivity to the actual SQL server, but this is actually creating unique objects when we look at the connectivity method so that other applications in Azure see this endpoint and can connect to this endpoint rather than an IP address or a fully qualified domain name. We can skip this because it does allow you to create these services after the fact, after deployment. The connection policy also here is how clients communicate with your SQL database server. When it's within Azure, by default, we've got default selected. When it's within Azure, it tells you right here, clients establish connections directly to the node using the redirect method. When it's outside of Azure, coming in, all connections are proxied via SQL database gateways. Remember that database.windows.net? That's really a proxy. There's only 2 IP addresses that resolves to, and from there, it knows based on the host name that's being connected to, the record that's being connected to. From there, it knows to redirect you to the correct Azure SQL instance in database using the proxy. So leave this as default, and for encrypted connections, you'll want to leave this as a minimum of TLS 1.2, that is the latest version, unless you have an really old application that needs to connect over older standards of TLS. Now, with that being said, I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit past security and additional settings because we just want to get this resource deployed and then connect to it via SSMS. So I am going to create this configuration real quick and deploy the Azure SQL database. It should deploy pretty quickly, so we'll come back to it when it's done. So it doesn't take terribly long for the resource to get deployed. We see that the SQL Server has successfully deployed with a database instance to it. But when we click on it, it says, get started working with your database. But first, we have to configure access to your SQL Server. It doesn't allow anybody in over the public internet by default. I know that was probably something you were worried about, is that when you deploy these and it's got a fully qualified domain name, that it just allows anyone in. It doesn't. Let's go to configure so that we can allow access for a specific network or a specific IP address to be allowed in. Check this out. With public network access, it does allow public network access to selected networks. Otherwise, we can just disable it outright. We can choose what virtual networks are allowed to connect to our public access endpoints if we created those endpoints. Otherwise, we could allow specific IP addresses or IP address ranges to be allowed in. It detects my IP address by default, so I can whitelist my IP address by clicking this Add Your Client IPv4 address and click Save. So now, only my IP address can connect in to the actual SQL Server instance itself, and then, of course, it has to pass authentication from there in order to actually be connected. So now that I've gotten my IP address whitelisted right here, you can also specify a firewall rule. So you can specify a starting IP and an ending IP if you want to whitelist a range or a subnet that you may have, public access to. So let's jump back to my SQL database now. And now that I've got the configured access, we could choose to connect. We could get our connection strings in order to actually connect our applications into it, or we could actually start editing or developing directly right here within the platform itself. Now that is in preview, the query editor, it's still in preview right here. I want to point that out. But you can, look, because we chose to log in with Azure Authentication, it does allow me to continue right here. Look, boom, Now I'm connected into this database where I can create tables and everything like that. I also see hooks into the Power Platform like Power BI, Power Automate, and Power Apps. Again, I want to stress this. Power Automate is something that individual users can use on their account. Logic Apps is the equivalent for developing a central workflow application, and that's probably better suited for most systems administrators. Now let's actually go ahead and get connected into this SQL Server. Let's see how we go about doing that. From the overview pane right here, I see my server name, knoxsql.database.windows.net. What I can do is I can actually launch SQL Server Management Studio on my local computer, and because I've whitelisted my IP address, I can go ahead and get connected in. Once SSMS gets launched up on my computer, it's still launching right now, then we'll go ahead and get connected. So here we go. SQL Server has launched on my screen. I'm going to change my server name to be the knoxsql.database.windows.net. Now, remember, I set this to be SQL authentication as well as Azure Active Directory authentication. So we have 3 different options for how to do Azure SQL or Azure Active Directory authentication. There's the universal with modern factor authentication, or multi-factor authentication, excuse me. So if you have modern authentication set up and MFA enabled on a particular account, this is the method that you want to specify. All you have to do is type in a username right here, and it'll actually pop up a window, kind of in an embedded browser, where it walks you through the login process and validates your credentials. Otherwise, you could specify your username and password right here. I'm just going to use SQL authentication right now because it's very easy. I know my username and password. I actually don't know my Azure password. All right, we're going to click connect here, and boom, I am connected in just like that, because there's my database, because I whitelisted my IP address and I used the credentials that we're allowed to use. So now I have successfully deployed a platform as a service offering using the Azure SQL Database options. In the next video, we'll take a look at how to do it with an elastic pool. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.